May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I am confident that each of us here has experiences of storms that are frightening, storms that arise suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere. Storms with big booms of thunder and bright flashes of lightning, storms with strong winds that bend the trees and blow unsecured outside items over, with winds that push so hard that you can hear and feel their movement even from indoors. Storms with driving rain that cause the roads to become streams and have downpours so fierce that you can barely see 100 yards in front of you. This common human experience of tremendous and awe-inspiring storms is one of the reasons that today's gospel passage is so memorable. It is not difficult for us to imagine what the disciples were going through. We can easily draw upon our own memories of fearsome storms as we hear this story. So let's set the scene with this storm in our gospel today. It is evening, and the disciples are in a boat on the Sea of Galilee in the midst of a storm. The winds are against them. They have been pushed far from land. The waves are battering their boat, or more literally, the waves are tormenting the boat. It is fierce. Sudden and very strong windstorms are characteristic of the weather patterns on the Sea of Galilee. Because many of the disciples were fishermen from Galilee, they would have been expert sailors who were familiar with what to do in these sudden and strong winds. They would have had experience handling a sailboat in high winds and choppy seas. But even so, it must have been a scary situation to be in. The text doesn't tell us what the disciples were thinking or feeling about being on the water in this storm. But the skills and work to keep the boat going in such difficult conditions are grueling. The disciples must have been very weary from fighting the winds and the waves. They must have been afraid. They were in a little boat in the middle of the water, far from land, and it was night. Perhaps they despaired of ever reaching the other side. It's at this low point, at this time of exhaustion, fear, and despair, when Jesus shows up and comes walking toward them on the sea. Our translation says that it was early in the morning, but the Greek is a little more specific. It states that Jesus came to them in the fourth watch, which is between 3 and 6 a.m. Those are the hours before sunrise, which can feel like the darkest part of the night. Jesus shows up for us as well in the times that are metaphorically like what the disciples were going through in this story. Times of our own personal storms, times of exhaustion, of despair. In those situations when we feel we are in the darkest night, we can take hope and comfort from this detail in today's gospel. But the disciples, they are terrified when they see this vision of Jesus on the water. It's understandable. They've been through a long ordeal. They are tired. It's still dark. There must have been fog and sea spray that made it difficult to see clearly. Additionally, because of their cultural beliefs, the disciples would have considered the water and the seas to be representative of the forces of chaos and evil. Anything coming out of the sea could not be a good thing. And then, of course, one would never expect to see a person walking on the surface of the water. The sight of that just would not make any sense. So we can't blame the disciples for not recognizing Jesus as he walked toward them on the water. Little wonder they thought he was a ghost. As Jesus approaches and hears their cries of fear, he doesn't waste any time letting them know that he is not a harbinger of doom. He calls out to them, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." These words of Jesus reveal God's presence and allude to Jesus' divine nature. The common English rendering of "it is I" in Jesus' words here obscure the Greek, which literally translates as "I am." So if we were reading the Greek, we would see that Jesus says to the disciples, "Take heart, I am. Do not be afraid." And as you may remember, "I am" is considered the divine name because it is how God answered Moses at the burning bush. When Moses asked God what name he should give when the Israelites asked who sent Moses to them, that is the name God gave him, "I am." In using these same two words as he approached the disciples, Jesus calls to mind the divine name. Jesus' actions allude to his divine nature as well. Jesus' ability to walk on the water and calm the seas were, of course, tied to his divine nature. But his actions also evoke phrases in the Hebrew scriptures about what God has done and what God continues to do. For example, in the book of Job, in which Job spoke of God trampling the waves of the sea at creation. Or in Psalm 89, in which God is praised with these words, "You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them." Jesus does godlike things in walking on the water and in calming the stormy seas. Thus, this story, in revealing Jesus' divine nature, can be thought of as a theophany, that is, a God showing, meaning a visible, tangible, or audible manifestation of God to humans. But it appears that at first the disciples did not understand that they were witnessing this. They did not say anything that demonstrated that God was with them. I expect, though, that at the time they were pretty worried about the waves and the wind and keeping the boat afloat, and they probably were not really capable of comprehending what Jesus was saying and doing in front of them. But were they comforted by Jesus' words? The passage doesn't tell us this directly, but the account does have Peter, who is often a sort of representative disciple in the Gospels, speak up. Peter says, "If you are Jesus, command me to come out onto the water with you." We can't know Peter's motivation for this request. Was he testing Jesus? If you really are Jesus, prove it. Have me walk on the water. Or was Peter's request an impetuous, not well thought out demand? Peter certainly could be impetuous, couldn't he? Perhaps he recognized that this was Jesus, and so his question stemmed from a desire to be with Jesus as quickly as possible, but without really considering what it might mean to be out on the water, outside the boat, with all the wind and waves. Jesus agrees to Peter's request. So Peter gets out of the boat, takes a few steps, and begins to sink in the sea. He cries out, "Lord, save me." And immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught Peter. Over the years, there have been many who have taken the viewpoint that Peter's sinking here indicates that he did something wrong. This thinking stresses Peter's role in being able to walk successfully on the water, saying, well, if only Peter had kept his eyes on Jesus, or if only he had more faith, or if he only tried a little harder, he would have made it all the way to where Jesus was standing. But what if Peter's sinking had nothing to do with what he did or did not do? Peter is not God. He cannot walk on the seas as God does, as Jesus just has. So perhaps Peter offers us an example of doing the right thing in crying out, "Lord, save me," when he was in trouble. And that's what Jesus does, saves him. The episode ends with Jesus and Peter getting back into the boat together. And as Jesus enters the boat, the winds cease. Notice that Jesus didn't have to rebuke them. They simply stopped. After the rescue of Peter, after observing Jesus' stilling of those raging sea and wild winds, the disciples finally get it. They realize that they have witnessed God's manifestation in Jesus, and they fall prostrate before him and say, "Truly you are the Son of God." The story in our reading from the Gospel of Matthew is a theophany. In it, Jesus is revealed as God's Son through his actions and words. Through it, we are offered a word of comfort. We are reminded that Jesus is the one who shows up in the storms of our lives. We are reminded that Jesus is the one who answers when we call out, "Lord, save me." And we are shown that even when we don't recognize him, even when we're not really sure that he is with us, Jesus is indeed the one who saves us.